What are you doing?
Looking for an episode of Season 7 I actually liked? I can't be negative all the time.
But you are.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean I want people to know that. No, let's see here. No.
What?
I've done it. I've found the holy grail of MLP. A good Season 7 episode. I thought they were just a myth.
Let me know when anyone cares.
Greetings, fillies and gentlecolts. I'm Onyx the Dragon, and I have found something quite remarkable for you today. But first, some context. Season 7. It exists, much to my chagrin. I did not like Season 7, or at least not overall. Too much of it was focused on Starlight for my taste, and I felt the Pillar arc was rather poorly executed, especially compared to the Key arc, for example. I'd like for these to be their own videos at some point in the future, but for today I've found the exception. Yes, folks, I'm doing something very unusual for this channel. A positive review. The lucky subject? A health of information, which in my opinion also makes a good case for why Season 6 and especially 7 fail. But as per the usual, my opinions on Season 7 remain unpopular, so I imagine you'll be wanting some elaboration, and elaboration you will receive. To start with, this episode opens on Zecora and Fluttershy. Considering the rhyming zebra has been seen only once or twice in the last 2 seasons, save for an alternate universe of course, I don't think there is a more effective way for this episode to differentiate itself, and right out of the gate to boot. Specifically, Zecora is helping Fluttershy to collect crisscross moss. I'm not sure what that is and no explanation is given, but it's not really important as it only exists as a catalyst. Particularly as a reason for Zecora to fall into the swamp bog and get sprayed on by this flower, causing her to contract a disease called swamp fever. Just the setup to this episode, and already I like it. Firstly, Fluttershy doesn't really have many other episodes this season, and Zecora certainly hasn't shown up in forever, so of course it's not hard to enjoy seeing both here. Unfortunately, Zecora doesn't actually star in this episode, but then she never really has, so it's not a surprise however saddening that may be. As for Flutters though, her only other main roles this season were in Fluttershy leans in and as a secondary character for Discordant Harmony. Starlight on the other hand, who mind you wasn't even treated like a main character last season, has all bottled up, a royal problem, to change a changeling, and both parts of Shadow Play. If that's not enough for you, or if me aiming criticism against Starlight makes you think I'm biased, Twilight has Celestial Vice, Fame and Misfortune for the most part is hers, Once Upon a Zeppelin, and Shadow Play again. That's 5 in both cases next to Fluttershy's 2 or 3. If we do the math and divide 26 episodes per season by 8 characters accounting for Spike, that means for equal screen time, everyone should get exactly 3.25 episodes, or just over half what Twilight and Starlight both get. Mind you, that doesn't account for the CMC or Discord, or anyone else who might like to have an episode, not to mention the ones that focus on the main cast as a whole. It also doesn't account for sharing episodes to be fair, but it's usually only 1 or 2 characters learning the lesson anyhow. It is true that Twilight's been the protagonist from the beginning, and Starlight was underused in Season 6, don't get me wrong, and yes, I realize strictly adhering to math may come at the expense of proper storytelling, but even so, the fact is there's only 26 episodes per season to go around, and when you put the extra focus on Twilight or Starlight, then inevitably the focus on Fluttershy or anyone else will go down. This is a problem because the more certain characters are used over others, the less variety there is in the season. Having that variety is why the show was able to make 6.5 main characters work, not to mention have such a broad appeal. The wide cast and focus on all of its members allowed for a more diverse range of episodes and made it more likely for any individual to find one that appeals to them. It is for this reason that Season 7's poor allocation of screen time pains me so. It defies the very wisdom upon which the show's success was built. Thus, the first point in my claim that a health of information is exceptional because it defies the tropes of Season 7 in favor of older methods is made manifest before the theme even plays. Where other episodes put focus on characters who arguably don't need it, this one places most of its focus on characters who don't already exceed the calculated amount.
But Twilight co-stars in this episode too.
True, but it's Fluttershy learning the lesson. Twilight's only here because she's the most logical character Fluttershy would turn to in her situation. She is the smart one after all. Fluttershy is the primary driver here though. Compare this to Starlight, who spends most of her episodes teaching the lesson instead of learning it. This actually brings me to my second point. In this episode, Fluttershy is the main character and she's the one learning the lesson, whereas in Starlight's case, she stars in a royal problem and Shadow Play, yet she is in both episodes the teacher. In older episodes, it was always the main character who learned the lesson. It's more compelling that way. If the main character knows the solution to the conflict, then odds are so does the audience. Yes, I realize MLP isn't known for its plot twists, but that's besides the point. Unless your story is a deconstruction, which tend to be incredibly difficult to pull off, you generally don't want your audience to know the solution to the conflict. This kind of leaves one feeling cheated in a sense, as well as causes the resulting story to be incredibly predictable. As one can imagine, this becomes an issue in MLP if more and more episodes start relying on that idea. Oh, and if a lot of those episodes focus on the same character, you can count on them leaving a bad impression too, because they'll be just as uninteresting as a story due to a lack of growth, not to mention mention the negative association. The same is true of a poorly executed deconstruction, because the core problem remains the same. My evidence for this claim will be a personal example. Frozen has been praised by many people as a great movie and a good deconstruction, not to mention a fun return to the tropes of classic Disney. I, on the other hand, found the movie to be predictable and incredibly annoying. To be fair, though, the latter might be due more to the incessant marketing this movie got. The core of Frozen's deconstruction is Hans. Hans is casted initially as this Prince Charming type character and is later revealed to be the antagonist. When I first saw the movie, however, I predicted this twist immediately after the song Love is an Open Door, and as a result, the movie just dragged on and on for me, because from there I could deduce pretty much the entire plot. Not helping was that Hans's actual turn came without warning and was more incredibly jarring in impact and shocking. This is what happens in MLP episodes where the protagonist knowing the solution is badly executed. Of course, with MLP, I at least enjoy the characters and world for the most part, so I can still be somewhat entertained. Classic Disney, on the other hand, never interested me, so you can imagine how I felt sitting through Frozen. After the theme, we rejoin our agoraphobic and zebra friends in the doctor's office. Quick question, why is the doctor's man a muffin? We find out in this scene that Sakura's contracted the previously mentioned swamp fever. Unfortunately, it's here where my major complaint with this episode lies. For one, I find it quite concerning Sakura's lived in the swamp for presumably quite a long time without knowing about a disease like this. Yes, the doctor did say it was obscure, but since when did Sakura not know something about the Everfree and its inherent environments? Heck, it was her who cured both the poison joke and the potion Apple Bloom used to give herself cutie pox. If any character should have known about this, it would be Sakura, not some random doctor. Speaking of doctors, the way both practice medicine is usually at odds in the real world, so seeing Sakura here is kind of weird. Also, it implies a message that, while scientifically accurate for the most part, I don't think the show meant to send. I guess Pinky Sense is getting so old that the lesson it taught the staff is starting to fade. Odd plot catalyst aside, we begin to move forward with the story. As it turns out, the end result of swamp fever is becoming the tree which causes it, which honestly seems like a fate worse than death to me. Understandably, Flutters takes this quite hard, believing herself personally responsible for what is effectively a fatal disease. Sakura, on the other hand, is taking this remarkably well.
Sakura, this is all my fault. If you hadn't been helping me get the crisscross moss, you wouldn't have gotten swamp fever. I'm so sorry.
Fluttershy, you are not to blame. These things happen all the same.
Sakura, this isn't some flu or spilled milk or something. This is literally a deadly disease. Well, one that turns you into a tree technically, but it may as well be deadly. Seems Sakura's step one down pat. As a result of her conviction, Fluttershy decides to pursue an ancient healer known as the Mystical Mask, an old legend who is in Starswell the Bearded for once. Shocking, I know. Anywho, the episode cuts to Flutters seeking out the aid of Bookhorse, who is found engaged in a cooking competition with Spike? Earl, why didn't you tell me Chopped was on?
You seemed busy looking for a Season 7 episode you actually liked.
Well, whatever. With Twilight's help, the two begin to scour the library. Strangely, however, it's actually Twilight who's finding herself out research this time, meanwhile Fluttershy is still going at it to her own detriment. And in this exhibit, we see another fine specimen for my thesis. You see, one of the major criticisms launched against this episode is that Twilight and Fluttershy have switched roles for the sake of the eventual moral, and are thus out of character. I, however, would beg to disagree, and in fact consider this to be a clever move because it demonstrates an understanding of the characters not usually seen in newer episodes. But let's tackle this one at a time. Firstly, is Fluttershy in character? Yes, absolutely. It's been established on multiple occasions across the series that she will go to extreme lengths, some of which even contradict what would otherwise be her own character, for the sake of others. For instance, how about the time in It Ain't Easy Being Breezies, wherein she took in a population of Breezies for which the episode is named. Yet, when they became dependent on her and risked their entire journey to stick around, Fluttershy came to expel the creatures from her home so that they would actually try to finish their job and journey. She acted in a way that is contradictory to her usual character because someone she cared about was at risk. Here, Sakura is literally at risk of dying, so it's not surprising she'd go to extreme measures to prevent this, namely out researching even Twilight. Mind you, that's the mayor who spent an entire weekend reorganizing our personal library for fun. Now comes in the more difficult question, is Twilight in character? I think so. Twilight spends most of the episode just going along with helping Fluttershy for Sakura's sake, while also trying to get Fluttershy to take a chill pill about the whole thing. Fluttershy being the one who's freaking out about the situation is also a point used to say the two are in each other's places. Of course, I just just explained Fluttershy, but as for Twilight, I think this is actually a good point of character growth. In Lesson 0, Twilight worked herself into a deeply disturbed frenzy over not being able to send her teacher Celestia the all-important weekly friendship letter, to the point of honestly believing failing to do so would have her sent back to kindergarten. In case you've forgotten, the entire moral of that episode was to not work yourself into unreasonable stress, which is exactly the development Twilight took from its events. The growth experienced here is further exemplified in Games Pony's play, where Cadance taught her the mysterious secret art of taking deep breaths, which she has gone on to use at various points in the series if you pay attention. Now that growth comes full circle in Twilight trying to teach Flutters to calm down. This goes on to factor into the moral of the episode, which not only justifies the two being out of place, but makes an integral part of the story. This is why I consider the move not only a non-issue, but something which actually works to better the episode. In fact, I'd go so far as to claim this is intentional. Twilight does ask Fluttershy to slow down and rest at several points in the episode, which correlates directly with the degradation of both Flutter's coordination and patience, and both directly factor into the moral. In addition, the progress Twilight makes between Lesson 0 and here is a very deliberate process of slowly learning and applying the lessons she's learned over said process. These don't happen by accident, let alone correlate in the same episode. Yes, I'm aware there's a difference between Lesson 0's moral of not overblowing problems and mistakes, and this episode's moral that one must help themselves to help others, but in this instance, the reason Fluttershy isn't helping herself is because she's taking the problem incredibly seriously, with good reason in my opinion, and thus clouding her own perspective. It is therefore through the lens of the former that Twilight reaches out to Flutters, being the origin of her own process of learning to properly assess problems. If anything, this characterization even further suggests the intentionality behind the role reversal by requiring even more coincidence for it to be an accident. This also transitions into another point against more recent seasons as well. In the past, the staff was more willing to use these characters to their fullest potential and recognize their older or lesser known traits. Newer ones, on the other hand, generally fail to do so. For instance, Rainbow's love of apple cider used to be a point of comedy in older episodes, especially when she co-starred in the ones focused on AJ like Super Speedy Cider Squeezy 6000. However, in recent times that trait was referenced only in the movie, which itself was the project of the older staff and kept them from being involved in the show as of late, and even then, the trait wasn't so much utilized as it was quietly referenced. In Health of Information, this is seen in the utilization of Flutter's kindness to reverse roles with Twilight as I discussed earlier. This is further seen in Twilight's library research early in the episode, especially when she gets excited over Fluttershy connecting the dots between the mystical mask and Mage Meadowbrook. While yes, Twilight's library serves as a frequent setting, as her role of princess becomes more and more of her character, her nerdy roots take less of a part in that character. While she does show some of that old adorkableness in this episode, the last time I remember it being referenced was when she organized the library for a whole weekend as mentioned earlier, and even that was in Season 6. Don't get me wrong, I'm completely fine with character growth and change. It's necessary to keep things interesting and of a high standard. In fact, her continual growth and evolution is why Twilight is my favorite of the main 6. It's when that growth comes at the cost of the charm which made older episodes and earlier incarnations of the cast work, or put more simply, jeopardizes the show's roots, that I object. Returning to the story, Fluttershy succeeds in connecting Mystical Mask to Meadowbrook. This in turn leads her and Twilight to seek out the old healer's home in Hayseed Swamp, a new location this time around. It should also be noted that Flutters has developed unsightly bags under her eyes from the all-nighter she just pulled. As the two reach the swamp, they find themselves in a dilapidated bayou village, of course with Flutters making a number of bumps along the way.
Reminds me of someone I know.
Really? Funny story, he told me if you don't shut up, I have permission to melt you down for scrap. The two make their way into the hollowed out tree that makes the old healer's residence, where they meet Cattail, who is surprisingly okay with strangers showing up unannounced in his ancestral home.
Y'all can stop screaming now. Didn't mean to scare you. I do that a lot.
Okay, where do I start with this guy? Cattail is probably one of the most standout secondary characters the show has ever produced. He just oozes a personality of laid-back calmness and genuine warmth that's never been quite matched in the show. He apparently just lets strangers up and walk into his home, for crying out loud. He doesn't really call attention to himself, but he doesn't need to. Instead, his nature commands that attention by way of simply existing. His character model is just as unique, with the beard bun and a torso that's larger than his legs. Even his eyes are differently shaped, looking more comparable to some kind of nutshell as opposed to the usual cat-like style. In fact, this takes me to a discussion about the attention to detail that this episode contains, and I love every second of it. Whenever Meadowbrook is being talked about, for instance, the background music changes to reflect her exotic origin.
Wait, listen to this. Today I tried again to brew an unsniffle elixir. And I finally got it right.
Or as another example, Twilight's expression in the background when Spike admits to eating the muffin she made back in that episode of Chopped, which I'm still upset about missing.
Name me one other individual who watches cooking shows unironically.
That is not the... Anywho, upon learning of his heritage, our heroines beseech Cattail for help, who in turn points them to the quote-unquote library. Among the small scattering of books are Meadowbrook's own diaries, one of which reveal the cure to swamp fever, the honey of the flash bee. There's just one problem. Flash bees are shown to be temperamental. Of course, that's not unusual for bees of any kind, but here it causes extra problems. They are called flash bees after all. While I'm on the topic, are all equestrian insects abominations from Tartarus? I will, however, say that I like how the world building in this episode doesn't destroy the show's canon, and here's another point as to why older episodes are better. This one, like the seasons before it, introduces world building in a way that enhances its own story without doing too much to change or contradict the direction of the show entirely. Meadowbrook, for instance, was brought into this episode as a vehicle for the cure. Since she's a character, however, the staff decided to put the time into her backstory and role in equestrian history, which in turn gives the fans world building. However, she's only mentioned here because she's relevant. Her existence doesn't cause massive changes to the present or pre-established world in this episode, and this leaves the writers free to experiment and world build as they please, within what makes the episode work anyway. When elements are handled like this, they pose less of a risk. Meadowbrook worked well and was well received, so she can be brought back later without issue. However, if she hadn't, then she could have been left to this episode alone without dragging down the rest of the show, very similarly to how one-off characters usually work. The former is exactly what happened with Starswirl. Since he worked well, he was used more and more and became more important naturally, and now he fits into the show so well that imagining it without him is rather difficult. Later seasons have been a bit more haphazard, however. Take for instance Flurryheart, who was introduced in the 6th season as Equestria's 5th alicorn. In response to her birth, Celestia spoke the now infamous line that Equestria had never before seen a born alicorn, which as we know contradicted previously unwritten canon that the royal sisters themselves were born alicorns, forcing us to question what we know about them. Not only that, but the role and honor of being an alicorn, which previously took the protagonist of the franchise 3 seasons to reach, was just casually handed off to a baby because, in the process, degrading the status and impact of being an alicorn, not unlike what became of Super Saiyans. Yes, it makes genetic sense, but those same genetics could have easily made her a unicorn. Baby cakes will make her sudden feats of magic work anyway, and you don't destroy the canon of alicorns in the process. Consider this. In Equestria, all alicorns, except for Flurryheart, are princesses and have a role. Celestia is the princess of the sun, Luna the moon, Cadence love, and Twilight friendship, and all of them have correlating duties. What is Flurryheart the princess of? Bad writing? I realize I'm going on a bit of a tangent here, but my point is that world building was handled much better in earlier seasons where it minded what was already established, hence the third point in favor of my thesis. Returning to our story, despite the potential electric chair-esque death, we know from her prior behavior that try to take the honey out of the Flash Beehive is exactly what Flutters is going to do. Unfortunately for her, Meadowbrook didn't happen to write down how she did it. Come to think of it, she doesn't seem to share much information at all. For someone who's later revealed in the season to be one of the great pillars of Equestria, wouldn't it make sense for her to have shared the cure for swamp fever? Yet the entire conflict for this episode exists because she did not. I don't know about anyone else, but I'm pretty sure that's a plot hole. Despite all the odds stacking against her though, Fluttershy is still unwaveringly determined to get her hands on that cure. However, matters become complicated when she finds she's contracted the troublesome disease herself.
What? Is my mane messy? I know I haven't slept in a while, but... Oh no! I've caught swamp fever!
So now you don't want to be a tree? Make up your mind! Of course, the sickness changes nothing. Flutters remains determined to get the cure ASAP without rest at the expense of her own health. This of course results in a number of symptoms of tiredness concentrating and worsening into the next couple of minutes to make the moral obvious.
You really should rest up before going up against those flash bees. They are nasty critters.
You don't know this about me, but I'm pretty good with animals.
Reduce critical thinking? Check.
And besides, Dogtail?
Cattail.
Forgetfulness? Check.
I'm sure she also took care of herself.
You're not gonna change my mind, Twilight!
Irritability? Check. As expected, she soon arrives at the Flash Beehive, wherein the reduced critical thinking I just mentioned is shown even more in her decision to actually obtain said honey entirely by herself, even though she just pushed Twilight and Cattail all the way there to spectate apparently. Though to be fair, her reasoning of not wanting to risk hurting them is noble, but I'm not convinced this isn't being done more out of stubbornness.
Mind over matter.
Oh, reduced energy and physical coordination. Check. As expected, things don't exactly go too well for her. I will say, however, the Flash Bee's apparent immunity to the stare is a bit annoying. It seemingly comes out of nowhere and is just contrived to justify the story. To be fair, it is necessary to prevent the Flash Bee's very nature from being negated, but I feel the execution could have been better. Just have either Meadowbrook's journal or Cattail mention that the aggressive nature makes them immune to methods that would normally pacify other creatures. Regardless, Flutters awakens in Cattail's home 3 days later, where the fire under her flank is heated up even more upon the news that Zecora is turning a new leaf.
Please, never do that again.
But after a forced rest, we find Flutter's ability to think clearly restored. She then proceeds to find the secret of attaining the honey by watching a Flash Bee nuzzle a healer's mask, which apparently resembles a Queen Flash Bee. This in turn leads her to be able to access the honey unopposed, and thereby cure herself and Zecora. I will say I'm confused by this scene more than anything though. When the actual Queen of the Hive sees the mask-clad Fluttershy, she simply acquiesces like all the other bees. In nature, when two Queen Bees encounter each other, they'll actually fight to the death, but then runtimes and ratings have to ruin all the fun, I suppose. Regardless though, the cure is found in the moral delivered, that being you can't take care of others if you won't take care of yourself. I think that does ring true, though admittedly I struggle to think of a situation where it actually apply that's much different from this episode, except maybe Parenthood. The story ends on a karmic note as the doctor from the beginning of this episode comes down with the illness himself. Overall, as stated earlier, I believe this is a great episode. Yes, the story does hit a few hiccups, but I find the strengths outweigh them in both numbers and magnitude. That's not, however, why I chose to discuss it. I chose to because I feel it's a good lesson to follow. I've made it no secret that later seasons, especially 7, did not impress me, and I feel this episode's successes where its contemporaries fail are a good reason why. Let's review. Better allocation of character screen time, better understanding and use of the characters, and more careful world building. First, there's the better use of screen time and allocation among the cast. Rather than give Twilight or Starlight a 6th starring role, the episode opts to put focus on Fluttershy, who had but one other major appearance this season, not to mention bringing Zecora back to the limelight for the first time since the cutie remark. Second is the better understanding of the characters and their personalities, displayed by the ability to have them temporarily switch roles without feeling unnatural or actually being out of character. It is an understood lesson in writing that you cannot break the rules until you know the rules. For the staff to play with the character tropes so well here demonstrates that understanding. The rest of the newer episodes, on the other hand, tend to forget older traits like Rainbow's love of cider or perhaps the gigantic apple family. Thirdly and lastly is the more careful world building as opposed to the more haphazard work of late. Meadowbrook doesn't have to break the previously established rules of MLP's world to exist. Flurry Heart, on the other hand, has complicated the meaning of alicorns to such a degree as to make them practically worthless. Not to mention she's drastically reduced the impact. After all, what meaning does working for 3 seasons to reach that status have when another one can just be born? Considering things like these, I think it's pretty easy to see why A Health of Information was perhaps the best episode since season 5, because it follows the wisdom of the show leading up to that season rather than the failures that followed it. It is my hope that season 8 can follow its example, but we'll have to wait and see. Thus, the final score for this episode, 7.92 out of 10. Thanks for watching. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, and share. This is Onyx the Dragon, signing out.